Ladies and gents, reaction. This is Eastern Front of World War II, animated 1942 by the channel Eastory. Yes, we saw the 1941 video a few days ago. It was epic, right? As far as the map go and all the markers and the things go, there has never been more detailed video like this. I've never seen anything like this. You know, his marker was moving, you know, just way too much, which means he probably researched every small battle and every small detail here and there for, you know, him to do that. And it was just incredible. And, you know, you could really feel it, the way the line was moving constantly. All those POWs, that was just horrible. Every time, you know, Germans basically trap Soviet forces, and 300,000 POWs, 60,000 POWs, 200,000 POWs, and god damn, they just took millions like it's nothing. So we'll see what happens here, I guess. The initial Axis invasion of the Soviet Union had ended with their forces being overextended, and the Red Army counterattacked them during the winter. Yeah, the winter came, right? Yeah, so basically Germans did the blitzkrieg mentality, surprise attack immediately, but they forgot to think that, oh, look at that, it's Russia basically, right? The terrain is way too long and big, maybe we won't get there in time. The fighting eventually became a stalemate. During the summer of 1942, both sides planned to undertake a major offensive in order to inflict a decisive defeat on their opponent. The question was who would be able to gain the initiative first. Oh god, are Soviets gonna lose more POWs in this, or the tide's gonna turn? Who knows? It's gonna be fun. Remember, if you like my reaction, don't forget to like, subscribe, check out the reaction, there's a link in the description. Check out the also different playlists like history with all of my historical videos like this, Oli Sarcastic Proxon with all of those reaction videos, oversimplified, CGP Korea, Kazakhstan in a nutshell. Yeah, let's watch it.
In 1941, the Axis invaded the Soviet Union, planning to overrun the
Wait a second, audio is a bit low. Oh, there you go.
European part of it before the onset of winter. However, the resistance was stronger than expected, and by the beginning of October, they had expended much of their offensive capabilities. Assuming that the Red Army was on the brink of collapse, they launched an all-out attack. The Soviet Union had still resources left, and the Axis forces found themselves overextended. The Red Army was seriously weakened, but it did not let the opportunity slip.
See, the thing is here, you know, Stalin led the country at the time and probably didn't have many generals, experienced generals who could do this, because every time these German forces suddenly all out just spearheads inside the enemy territory, right? Surprise attack, trying, you know, just trying to force their way in. Like, you know, this force is right here. They suddenly try to push inside. That would easily clear their flanks, right? So Russian could, you know, create some kind of a strategy where they would try to trap them. Because that's why, you know, in any battlefield, people don't suddenly try to surge forward, right? Any one part of the army. Because that would basically open the flanks where people could trap you. So they could have tried something like that as soon as they push forwards, because not everybody's not pushing forward, only this side, maybe this side, they are suddenly pushing forward, and that opens the gaps like this. They didn't capitalize on that. This happened in, you know, previous video too. They were just suddenly attacking and flanks were open, but yet they were not trying to trap them.
And counterattacked with all available forces, forcing the Axis into a retreat. In the Black Sea region, the Soviets undertook an amphibious operation. They landed their forces in the Crimea, survived the Axis counterattack, and made preparations to take the whole peninsula. In Ukraine, they pushed towards the Dnieper River and managed to gain ground before their attack was contained. Near Leningrad, the Red Army broke a breach into the German line and pushed into their rear, threatening to unhinge their front. The Soviets concentrated most of their forces against the Army Group center. After having pulled back from the approaches of Moscow, the Germans decided to stand fast and regroup on their present positions. This gave the Red Army a chance to conduct an encirclement of the German forces. Overextension had created several gaps in the German lines, and Red Army exploited them in order to bypass and cut off the German units. Despite of moving behind the German lines, they did not have enough strength to cut the main railway supplying the German forces, and the Germans were able to cut off and contain the breakthroughs. In the north, the Soviets encircled the German Second Corps at Timians, but it was sustained by air supply. After realizing that it lacked the strength to conduct a major attack, the Red Army concentrated its efforts on the most promising.
Okay, I was just about to say why he's saying traps and not POWs, because they're not POWs, they're still fighting. And Germans are supporting them with air. Oh, look at the differences, man. Difference between two two armies.
sectors. However, by this time the Germans had secured their position and the attacks achieved only minimal progress. After having reorganized further, the Germans were able to conduct small offensives of their own in the most critical sectors. They destroyed some Soviet units in the Army Group Center's rear and re-established a land connection with the Demyansk pocket. As the winter ended, both sides drew up their plans for the summer. The Soviets were rebuilding the Red
Look at that, Soviets are holding out too. That's a Soviet, right? That's a Soviet side.
Army, but it would be far from ready by summer and the Axis would still have the upper hand. The Soviets believed the Axis would use this to undertake a major offensive towards Moscow and prepared to take a defensive stance. The question was what to do with the many salients that had been formed in the front. They provided good opportunities for the encirclement of both the Axis and Soviet units and were difficult to defend. In order to conduct a successful defense, they would have to be eliminated. One option was to abandon the salients, the other was to destroy the Axis-held salients. Although it was not clear if the Red Army would have enough strength to do so, they decided to risk it. They would destroy the Axis forces in...
Okay, first of all, Germans are fighting on both sides, like Western Front and Eastern Front. So their forces are kind of, there has to be some forces here, if not the, most, because they diverted all into the Eastern Front. But Soviets are not fighting anything in their east side. So why are not they just, taking all of the soldiers and, put them on the border? They would definitely overwhelm the Nazis, right?
Vulnerable positions, and this would drain the strength from the main Axis attack. After the main attack was repelled, the build-up of the Red Army would have
there you go, now they are joining in. They should have just sent them from the start.
Reached a level that would allow it to go on a major offensive. The Germans were indeed preparing to carry out a major attack. Comparing with the previous year, their resources had decreased and they were unable to mount a large Barbarossa-style offensive. Instead, they planned to undertake several consecutive offensives in order to destroy the Soviet Union. As the first step, they would capture the Caucasus oil fields in order to deny the Soviet Union most of their oil supply and gain a long-term source of it themselves. This would allow the Germans to continue waging the war in full capacity. Next, Leningrad would be taken, and then the Murmansk Railroad would be cut, depriving the Soviet Union of its main sources of foreign aid. Meanwhile, in the center, the German forces would hold their forward positions in order to provide a good springboard for an offensive. After the Red Army had been...
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. The German plan makes sense. The way how things were going for the Nazis and how Hitler was at the time. They wanted resources first, so they would attack resources area first and hold line everywhere else. As soon as they gain their resources, right? Like, okay, we have oil and all the resources we need. Now they can, think about greater plan to basically attack Soviet Union more deeper.
Weakened by previous steps and the Axis had freed up their forces, they would occupy the main Soviet industrial base in central Russia. Before and during the main operations, the Axis would clear out as many of the contested areas as possible to free up more troops. The first Soviet attack was in the north, where they attempted to push the Axis forces back in order to increase the security of the Murmansk Railroad, but they failed to make any serious advances in the rough terrain and went on a defensive. The next operation was meant to destroy the most vulnerable German salient at Timians, but the Germans continued to hold on to their positions and their progress was minimal. The next operation was undertaken by the Axis in the southernmost part of the front. In the Crimea, the open steppe suited well for close air support and the Germans used it to break through the Soviet lines. The Red Army had previously conducted several offensives and its forces were deployed forward, lacking the depth to contain the Axis breakthrough. The Soviets were unable to stop the Axis advance and had to abandon the peninsula.
How many 170,000 POWs like that? Holy shit, look at the numbers, man. Right? Just few centuries ago, these are the numbers people used to fight entire wars. This is the whole army. Look at in World War II, 170,000 is like nothing. Yeah, it's just another POWs, group. We just took 300,000 before, 60,000 before, why not?
In Ukraine, the Soviets had finished their preparations first and went on the offensive, attempting to take Kharkov with a two-pronged attack. The Axis forces were not far behind in their deployment, and 5 days after the beginning of the Soviet attack, they went on an offensive of their own. The Red Army did not anticipate such a move, and the German units managed to cut off the attacking Soviet troops and destroy them.
Are you kidding me? Holy shit, Germans that is their main strategy, just trap them, closing the flanks. Why are Soviets going like, okay, this is the second year, this shit is happening, doesn't matter what you do, doesn't matter if you don't gain any areas, make sure that your flanks are secure, because this is just ridiculous. 250,000 POWs.
In the north, near Leningrad, the Soviets were unable to fully exploit their breakthrough. Having realized the vulnerability of their...
Look at this shit. Why is this flank open? Just go back a bit if need be, because this can easily, they could cut you off, I guess.
...position, they decided to evacuate the salient. However, the Germans beat them to it and cut the neck of the salient. During the next month, the encircled Soviet forces were eliminated. In the center, both the Soviets and the Germans were preparing their own offensives. As the German operation was of smaller scale, it was ready first, and they proceeded to clear out the pocket south of the railroad. Soon, they had full control over the territory, although part of the Soviet forces managed to escape and reach their main lines. After having regrouped their forces, they turned against the northern salient. They cut its communications with the main Soviet front and pushed into it, eliminating most of the Soviet units. Destruction of the Red Army formations behind the Germans.
Oh god, how many Soviets died in the Eastern Front? Holy shit. First of all POWs are basically, most of them going to die. The treatment, how Nazis did. And some of them, they just point blank just killed here.
German lines forced a change in the Soviet plans, and their offensive in the center was postponed. In the south, the failure of the Kharkov offensive had left the Red Army in disarray, and the Germans decided to exploit the opportunity. They conducted 2 smaller attacks, but this time the Soviets pulled their forces back and did not offer strong resistance. The amount of prisoners taken was limited.
Come on.
Now everything was ready to carry out.
POWs are making me crazy. Holy shit, man. How about Soviet, take German POWs for fuck's sake? How overpowered Nazis were, man. Here, they're just basically, any reason Russia hold out is because of their numbers, I think. Because so far, Nazis been way too powerful.
Out the German plan to capture the Caucasus. As the first step, the Axis forces would encircle and destroy the Soviet formations on their southern flank. Then they would advance and take strong defensive positions along the Volga and Don rivers to cut the communications between the Soviet heartland and the Caucasus. This would shield the Axis forces in the south from the main force of the Red Army. As the third step, the Axis forces would move into the Caucasus and take over the oil fields. The first German attack reached the Don River as planned. The Soviets expected that they would turn north towards Moscow and deployed their reserves, conducting a counterattack from this direction. In the south, the Red Army began to withdraw to avoid encirclement. Because the German plan was founded on the assumption that the Soviets would avoid retreat, as they had done in the previous year, they were now confronted with the possibility of Soviet forces escaping the encirclement. They altered the plan, sending the forces
Nazis with a Pikachu face. They'll learn something from previous year. They are not taking the bait. We can't encircle them. Of course you can't, because there's they can notice that so many people are not here anymore. Thousands and thousands and even millions basically are not around because they all got trapped
immediately to the south in order to catch the Soviet units. However, the Soviet formations further south joined the...
Okay, how the fuck that unit can just walk like that? Is that a Panzer unit? What is that? What doesn't matter what it is. Why can't they just trap them? Their flank is just open.
Retreat, allowing most of them to escape the encirclement. By this time, the Soviet command had understood the German intentions and had deployed their strategic reserves to keep the Axis away from the Volga River. Meanwhile, their other forces retreated south over the Don. During that time, the Germans had also captured Sevastopol, and when it was clear that the Caucasus direction was properly covered, they sent their freed up forces north to take Leningrad. In the central part of the front, the Germans were finishing the preparations to destroy another Soviet salient, but before that, the Red Army had finished deployment and commenced its offensive against the Army Group center. The Germans reinforced the defenses and then attempted to cut the southern Soviet salient with weaker forces, but were unable to. The terrain in the area of the Soviet attack was not suitable for the use of heavy weapons, and the main brunt of the fighting fell to the infantry, which suffered heavy casualties. Despite pushing the Germans back, they were unable to destroy their...
Okay, there are no Germans here, only one unit? What the fuck? And why are they all standing there? Why can't they just encircle them here?
Their forces. Limited attacks continued for a month more, but they failed to secure more territory. In the north, the Germans planned to use reinforcements from the Crimea to cut off Leningrad. In addition, they planned to undertake several operations in order to improve their defensive positions. The Red Army was meanwhile preparing to re-establish the land connection to Leningrad by pushing through the thin strip of the German-held territory. The Soviets attacked first, and the Germans had to use the reserves to repel them. The defense tied up their forces and they lost the time they needed for the encirclement of Leningrad. In addition, they could spare enough troops only to widen the neck of the Timians salient. In the south, the Axis had failed to destroy the Soviet formations opposing them, but in the same time the quick retreat had thrown the Soviet forces into disarray, putting them in need of reorganization. Meanwhile, the Axis troops were left unscathed. The Germans decided to solve the situation by not allowing the remaining Soviet units to reorganize and moved immediately towards the Caucasus, while the other part of their forces would secure the flank. The Soviet forces continued their retreat until they reached the Caucasus Mountains. There they made a stand and dug in on the bottlenecks. In the north, the Germans used the open steppe terrain to outmaneuver the Soviet reserves and moved slowly towards Volga. By the end of August, they had reached the river and entered the city of Stalingrad and began to slowly clear out the city. In the Caucasus, the German Alpine troops traversed the mountain passes, but
I guess now one of the most bloodiest battle ever is gonna come, I guess. Stalingrad, right? Holy shit. So Stalingrad is where everything turned around as far as I can remember.
They lacked the strength to reach the sea and were stopped on the southern slopes. During the following months, the spread out Axis forces continued to make small gains. Although the Axis had made serious advances, they were unable to deliver a crippling blow to the Soviet war effort and decided to complete their objectives in the next year. They anticipated that the Soviets would have enough strength for a winter offensive in one sector and that they would attempt to destroy the salient in the central part of the front. The Germans countered the threat by deploying their reserves. Meanwhile, in the south, the Axis forces attempted to improve their positions as much as possible before the onset of winter. They tried to cut off the Red Army units in the Black Sea coast, but they could not break through the hills. In the central Caucasus, the Germans caught the Red Army off balance and moved deep into the hills until the Soviets redeployed their units. After that, coming of the winter snow put an end to the offensives in the Caucasus. By the Volga, the Axis forces had advanced steadily during the last months, and in the middle of November, they were in the process of removing the last Soviet presence in Stalingrad. They were not expecting a major attack in the south, and instead of creating a defense in depth, the forces of the Axis flank were deployed offensively, concentrated in the east at the point of effort. In this situation, the Soviet breachheads over the Don were considered of secondary importance and were covered by Romanian forces, who lacked anti-tank equipment and were not keen on fighting. Contrary to German estimations, the Red Army had the forces to conduct 2 winter offensives. They had deployed their second force in the south to make full use of the Axis.
Look at that, it's just 450,000 German versus 1.1 million Soviets. And still Germans are overpowering.
Deployment in this sector. The Red Army managed to achieve surprise and overran the Romanian forces opposing them. Then they broke into the undefended Axis rear, cutting off their forward units. Next, they had planned to reach the sea and cut off all the Axis forces in the Caucasus region. However, some of the Red Army forces had to be diverted to repel the German attempt to relieve the Stalingrad pocket, and the advance could not be conducted to full extent. The year in the south ended with the Soviets crushing all Axis hopes to sustain their forces.
I'm waiting for this thing to say POWs, because I really want to see Nazi POWs now, because this has been ridiculous. Soviet POWs was driving me crazy. Every time, 50,000, 60,000. At least take 5,000 of Germans, man, come on.
In the Caucasus and Stalingrad, and were threatening to advance into Ukraine. At the same time, the Red Army was attempting to cut the German salient in the center. The Germans had deployed their reserves and were prepared for the attack.
It's twice.
The Soviet attacks were met with staunch defense, and where they were able to penetrate the German defenses, they were thrown back by counterattacks. The Soviet offensive failed to achieve its objectives, and only in the western sector did the Red Army achieve some success. Thus, 1942 came to an end. The Soviets had secured the oil, and now the Wehrmacht lacked a proper plan to defeat the Soviet Union. The Soviet forces were moving west with the hope to inflict a decisive defeat on the Axis. At the same time, the Germans attempted to save the situation and create a stalemate. Whether they are successful will be decided in the next year. There's another question. How could I animate so many divisions? Well, I couldn't have done this without my patrons on Patreon, and I would...
Yeah, people, go to the original video page link and support the channel from there. Damn, I mean, I love the Stalingrad thing in the end that happened. They're just like, oh hell no, just, encircle the Nazis. They tried to help them, couldn't do it. But it's not POW, I think they're still holding out yet, right? But I guess Stalin just thought, you know what, I'm gonna let everything go, but not my city. It's named Stalingrad. We make a stand here. So that's where everything's gonna change, I guess. The trapped Nazi army, are they going to turn into POWs or what? We'll see it in the next video, I guess. Damn, I'm loving this series so far. This channel is awesome. All the small details here and there. Those POWs were making me crazy every time. Soviet POWs. No wonder I saw that Fallen of the World War II video in that so many Soviet and Russians died. It's not surprising after seeing something like this. Alright people, that was the Eastern Front World War II animated 1942 by the channel Eastory. If you like my reaction, don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out the reaction, there's a link in the description. Check out the cards or place, check out the cards, and yeah, I'll see you next time.